Good afternoon. On behalf of the BC Centre for Employment Excellence, welcome all to today's webinar. I'm Susanna Gurr, the Managing Director at the Centre. The Centre for Employment Excellence was established last year with funding from the provincial and federal governments. It is a research and knowledge sharing organization with a mandate to act as a coordination point for research for employment in BC. It connects both the BC employment services sector and the employer community with the best and emerging information about employment programs, practices, and tools. We are delighted to mark the beginning of our second year with the launch of a new series of webinars that aim to share useful and relevant knowledge with career development practitioners across the province. The response to this webinar has been amazing, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I will hand it over now to Sean Duraff, who is the research coordinator at the Centre.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar. We're so pleased at the turnout today. We had over 100 people register for this, our very first event, and we're very excited about that. Obviously, this is a topic that is of interest to a lot of you, and we're so happy to be able to share it in this way with such a large group across the province. The Centre's mandate is not only to do research, but to find ways to share that knowledge and best practices with BC practitioners and employers. This is very much a work in progress for us. We are building up our website to feature best practices, tools, and resources that can inform practice. And if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to visit us at CfEEBC.org and check out what we have to offer. In addition to postings on our latest happenings with research, we also offer a knowledge clearinghouse where we posted nearly 200 items regarding the latest research, best practices, tools, and resources that are there for you, covering all of our populations of interest. We also have a video series, Learning from Practice, that's highlighting in a very accessible way some of the great work being done by BC practitioners who serve different populations. Over the past year, the Centre has been conducting in-person consultations in each region of BC. We've also done presentations at BCCDA, Aspect, and also the recent Ministry of Social Development Symposium on Specialized Populations. We thought of this webinar series as a way to complement our in-person activities to increase our reach across the province and engage more practitioners. Through this series, we plan on highlighting new research by the Centre, but we'll also be tapping into the knowledge and expertise within the practitioner community. While today's event will be on a recent study by the Centre, our next webinar in July will feature Chris Arnold of the Provincial Networking Group in Terrace, BC. Chris will be speaking about networking and building relationships with employers. Please mark your calendars for Tuesday, July 16 at 12 p.m. for that webinar. In today's event, we'll be turning the mic over to Roberta, Neault, and Deirdre Pickerell of Life Strategies. They'll be presenting the findings from a study they conducted for us on the skills that today's career practitioners in BC need in order to do their jobs effectively. I'm sure that both Roberta and Deirdre don't need much of an introduction. They both have decades of experience working in this sector as practitioners, educators, and researchers. Their research has been featured many times at provincial, national, and international conferences, and both have received well-deserved recognition for their leadership in career counseling and development at both the provincial and national levels. We are pleased that they undertook this study for us and that they have agreed to present their findings to you today. Before I turn it over to Roberta and Deirdre, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. The presentation will last approximately 40 to 45 minutes. Due to the high number of participants, we will be muting the audience throughout the webinar to ensure audio quality. We encourage you to use the chat feature on your dashboards to submit questions. We will be compiling those questions and giving about 10 minutes at the end for Roberta and Deirdre to answer them. We are recording, and we plan on posting the video on our website after the webinar is over, with further opportunities for everyone to continue the conversation on our website. I just want to remind you, if you do lose your internet connection, please reconnect using the email link, the link that was emailed to you. If you lose your phone connection, for those of you accessing it that way, redial the phone number, which appears under the Info tab, and rejoin. Now I'm going to turn it over to Roberta and Deirdre to undertake the presentation.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. It's so exciting to have such interest in this topic. We're going to briefly set the scene just so you have some context for this research and what we did and what happened. We'll describe the research methodology really briefly, and then we'll share some of the highlights of the results with you, but know that the full report, which is quite a comprehensive report, is available on the center website, so there's nothing being held back. And then what we'll do is discuss some of our recommendations and our response to these results, and then we'll turn it back over to Sean to wrap up, and then we'll take questions. So all along, if questions come to mind, use that chat tool, type them in. Greg, Sean, and Susanna will be compiling those questions, and we'll get to as many as we can before our hour is up. But if there are more questions than we have time to answer, then we'll continue this conversation online on the Center's blog. Okay, so from a setting the scene perspective, okay, I just got muted, so I'll start over. So from a setting the scene perspective, as all of you are aware, career development practitioners in BC are in a state of transition. One of the things that we'll get to later are the stats of who responded to our survey, but it's important to know up front, I think, that it was just over a third of the people responding to our survey that actually were working in Work BC centers. So we're talking about career development practitioners in BC that go far beyond people that are just working in centers that were directly impacted by the changes that happened a year ago. So the changes that have happened can briefly be summarized into different contracts and different funders, but even if someone isn't directly working within the new contract, then there's a spillover to other services within the community, to even related organizations like community living have been impacted by the change. People have different job titles, they have different positions, there's different requirements for those positions now, and need different skills to do their jobs. So even though the biggest change happened in the restructuring of the Work BC centers, there's definitely a spillover. To give you a broader context, nationally and internationally, the practice of career development is in transition. And so people are trying to decide how best to help the working population, whether to do it within organizations or whether to be providing services at different hours so that people who are at work are able to access it in the evenings and on weekends. There's, of course, more stuff available online. So lots and lots of changes happening that are impacting all of our work. So within this context, the Center, who's funded by the Provincial Government, commissioned research to help career development practitioners by investigating skills and skill gaps, and then also preferred methods for skill development and training within our sector. So we approached this research by doing an environmental scan, a lit review, but not necessarily just looking at academic literature, but looking at what else has been published, particularly around the notion of competencies to be a fully equipped career development practitioner. And so we knew that we had our standards and guidelines, and we did use that as the basis of the online survey, but we also wanted to look at what the literature was saying about emergent competencies. And some of the emergent competencies that we saw written about in literature, but also in other competency frameworks, were advocacy, were competencies related to using social media effectively, and also were competencies related to technology in general. And so in our online survey, what we did was use the Canadian Standards and Guidelines as a basis for competencies, because that's a competency framework that's well accepted within our field in Canada. But we also added in some of these emerging competencies. So for those of you that completed that survey, you know it was crazy long. And we apologize for that. We apologize up front. We continue to apologize. But we felt like it was the most effective way to create a survey that was actually mapping against other work that's been done in our field. And so that's what we chose as a method. We then followed up on some of the puzzling survey results using a tool called ThoughtStream that allowed us to pose some questions and engage people in follow-up discussion. And some people in the online survey had noted that they would be open to that kind of follow-up. And so a smaller group of people that completed the online survey participated with us in ThoughtStream. And then we also engaged in some key informant interviews, and those were with educators in our field in BC, and also with some employers that have been leading the way through this transformation, and also with some ministry representatives distributed across the province. And so what we were trying to do was get different perspectives from people not necessarily working in the field but are closely connected, and also with some of the educators that have had the opportunity to develop competencies amongst career development practitioners in BC, and we were interested in what they were seeing. We also then conducted some focus groups, and together those comprised 50 or more career development practitioners, and we held sessions in Hope, in Prince George, in the Lower Mainland, Nanaimo, Terrace, and Nelson. Some of those were full dedicated focus groups. Some of them were tacked onto other center presentations, and some of them ended up, one of them, Nelson in particular, ended up being by teleconference because the flight that I was at the airport to get couldn't take off that morning because of snow. And so I turned around and came back to my office, and we facilitated that group by teleconference. So we tried to engage as many people across the province as we could in this survey, well, in the overall research. So here's what we found. The demographics of the people that responded were mainly women, mainly in the 48 to 65 age group, and mainly working in the sector for 10 or more years. Interestingly, this is the same demographic that you'll see replicated in studies across Canada in our sector. So we felt that it was fairly representative. We had regional representation from the Vancouver, Richmond, Lower Mainland area out to Hope. That was about half of our representation, but about a fifth of the people were on the island, about another fifth were in the Okanagan, Kootenay, Caribou region, and 6% were from the north. So we were really pleased to attract representation from all over the province. As I mentioned earlier, only 39% were in EPBC centers, although almost all of them were impacted by the transition. And the most common educational level was an undergraduate degree or a diploma. And the most common credential, not surprising, were in BC was the CCDP. But we also asked how many of them have got that through grandfathering, and 79% had. So why that was important to us is whether or not they were CCDP who had gone through an entire program in training, or whether, as it turns out was the case, that there were people who had had significant experience in the field already, as you can see by the demographics, most of them working in the sector for 10 or more years, and then had had this recent training in theories and ethics, which was required for the grandfathering piece. Most common participants were case managers or supervisors and managers, and that will be important later on as Deirdre starts to report out on some of the results. And we asked them what populations they were most commonly serving, and the groups that came up highest were people with disabilities, persons with multiple barriers, older workers, Aboriginal peoples, and youth. And so again, that's important because it means that the skills of the people that responded to our survey would have to reflect competency to work with these specialized populations. We also, in general, asked just whether they would identify with that title, career development practitioner, because we know it's kind of strange language and not everyone gets it. But 73% of the people that participated in our research overall said yes, definitely. So from a perception of skill level, we always, or recently, have started to ask two questions, because we've found very similar results every time we ask it, and we think it provides really good context for analyzing the results. What we did was ask people how they would rate themselves in terms of their skills as a career development practitioner. So that's the personal self-rating, and as you'll see here, it was a very happy group. So most of them, by far, almost twice as many, felt they were very skilled as somewhat skilled. But they were almost entirely in the somewhat skilled and very skilled category. Hardly anyone saw themselves as somewhat unskilled, and nobody identified that they were very unskilled. So this is how people are rating themselves. We then asked them how they would rate the average career development practitioner, how they would rate their colleagues. Slightly different profile here. A few thought that their colleagues were very unskilled. More than thought themselves as somewhat unskilled, evaluated their colleagues as somewhat unskilled. And where you saw the bulk of the rating here was in the somewhat skilled category. So most people acknowledged that their colleagues were somewhat skilled. Hardly anyone thought that their colleagues were very skilled. When you compare that, you know, it looks like around 30%. The numbers are accurate on the report, but here it's hard to read. But 30% sort of saw their colleagues as very skilled, whereas 60% saw themselves as very skilled. So that kind of a disconnect is important as you start to analyze results, because it would make sense that someone who sees themselves as very skilled might not see themselves as needing skill development. And it would also make sense that people who are unsure about the competencies of their colleagues, or many supervisors, managers reported in for us, if they don't see the skills and competencies as very high on their direct reports, then it makes you less likely to want to refer to other people or to expect them to be able to perform in a competent way. So there's implications to this disconnect here. Moving on to the key findings, and then Deirdre will start to talk about really specific skills. We saw some skills disconnects. We saw, we asked some questions related to skill development, what people's preferred approaches were and what their barriers were to skill development. And we also saw some transition challenges. So people were struggling with working their way through policy. To give you another contextual piece of information, this research was conducted very early this year in the winter, sort of January through to February. And so they weren't even a year yet into the changes in Work BC. There were transition challenges related to money, some in terms of having finance to do what they wanted to do, but also some in just understanding the whole financial model of Work BC, and then transition challenges related to time. So Deirdre's going to move on and talk about some of the people rating the importance of their role and also self-rating their competency, and we'll explain some of the disconnects that we found.
Thanks, Roberta. And before I do that, I just wanted to quickly look at this key findings, just to add one more comment, and that is the first two things around the skills disconnect and the skill development were questions that we specifically asked or targeted in the survey and in the thought stream and in the focus group. But this whole theme around transition challenges are things that surfaced, whether in adding qualitative comments to the survey or in the thought stream, but especially in the focus group, this bundle of information that came forward, largely unsolicited from our participants, all had to do with their experience in this massive transition and transformation that they've recently gone through. So as we move forward and talk about some of the skills disconnect, I wanted to once again emphasize or point out that the full report is on the CfEE website. And the biggest reason for this, of course, is that you can see that there is a key down the bottom of this table here, this chart here, and there's no words associated with A, B, C, or D, or any of those. So we're going to talk about those, but the detailed information is absolutely available in the report that's on the CfEE website. So as Roberta mentioned earlier, when we did the online survey, we used the Canadian Standards and Guidelines as the framework, and we added some competencies that came up through the literature. And what we asked people to do was first rate the level of importance of the skill or competency in their current role, and then we asked them to self-rate. And so what we started to see throughout all of the data, not only the metadata, but in terms of specific job roles, was what we're calling the skills disconnect. So up here we have the top important skills. We have not only the importance, but the self-rating. So you can see the first one, A, is use effective listening skills. So our respondents felt that use effective listening skills was important. It was also something that they rated themselves as highly as having. So we're good at doing that. You can see with the next one, which is B, follow the code of ethics. It was also rated as important, but it didn't rate as highly in terms of self-rating of skill. Where we start to see a bigger disconnect is down at I. And what I is demonstrate awareness and knowledge about diversity. So it came up high on importance, but relatively lower in terms of self-rate for skill. So that's where we start to see a disconnect. I need to understand and demonstrate awareness and knowledge about diversity, but I'm not rating myself as highly in that. And J is use planning and time management skills. So it's become very important in my role, but I'm not rating myself as highly. And so we've seen this disconnect in these top 10 important skills. The other thing that we see and that's available in the report is looking at the data in the opposite way. So what are the self-rated skills that come up in the top 10 and what's their level of importance? And I'm just going to briefly summarize that on the next slide here. So for both profiles, how important it is and self-rating, the top-rated skill was use effective listening skills. Not a surprise. It's something that we have to do with our clients, with our colleagues. There were also low ratings for community capacity building and career development theory. So these were both, it's not particularly important, and I don't rate myself very highly. Community capacity building was not a surprise for us. We know that it was a competency or an area of specialization within the standards and guidelines that was a bit of an add-on. It's very important stuff, but it doesn't seem to have resonated as highly as some of the other competency areas. But the one that was a surprise for us was career development theory. So if you remember just a few moments ago, Roberta talked about 79% of the respondents that held the BC Certified Career Development Practitioner credential had obtained that credential through grandfathering, which meant that we know that those career practitioners had very recently taken a 20-hour series course. So we would have anticipated that in terms of being able to use and apply career development theory, that the people that had just taken training in career development theory would have recognized its importance in using it with clients and also had felt that they a little bit more confidence in their skill. And that's just not what the research has shown us within this study. In terms of potential skill gaps, so these are things that were rated highly as important. These things are important in my role, but I'm not as confident in my skills. Anything to do with technology, effectively operating computer applications, email, word processing, switching back and forth between screens, any of those sorts of technology skills seem to be a gap. And understanding ethical concerns of electronic communication and or social media was also a gap. It was recognized, again, as important in current roles, but that there seems to be a need to develop this skill. Throughout the report, what we've also done is look at the skills disconnect across roles. So we're just going to share a few of them here for you. So this is the supervisors and managers. And you can see that there's some significant skill deficits right around J, K, and L. And so we'll talk about what those are. So supervisors. Oh, Roberta made a suggestion to maybe read through the whole list. So A is demonstrate respect diversity for all clients. So supervisors and managers are rating that as important and also as fairly highly skilled in that. Demonstrate professional attributes is B, and there's a small disconnect there. Prepare for program delivery, rated as important, but not as highly rated in terms of self-rating. Initiate and maintain effective relationships with key community partners is D. And again, you can see a disconnect beginning to emerge in that one. Follow the code of ethics and apply the ethical decision-making model is E. And F, apply a solution-focused framework. And we saw a bit of a balance with those two in terms of importance and self-rating. The same with G, respond to clients' needs. Establish and maintain a collaborative work relationship is H. So again, you can see that disconnect, although slight, beginning to emerge. And then I, demonstrate awareness and knowledge about diversity, once again, appears to be a bit of a disconnect within our sector. And then J, use planning and time management skills is where we really start to see a disconnect. So it's rated as important for these are incumbents in the position, but not rated as highly skilled. So there seems to be a skill deficit there. Evaluate and provide service to clients is K, and clarity and provide feedback is L. So again, two that are rated as important skills for supervisors and managers to have, but the incumbents in that position are not confident in their skills in those two areas. Now, when we switch and start to look at the top skills in terms of self-rating, what we see, the pattern that we see for supervisors and managers are those, what we could say, more traditional services or skills and competencies that career practitioners would have. So supporting clients in writing their resumes, in writing cover letters, in preparing their career portfolios, supporting clients in interview preparation, in work maintenance type activities. We see those skills as highly self-rated. So our sample is saying, hey, I'm really good at helping my clients write resumes. But those skills are not needed or not rated as important for supervisors or managers. So we seem to have, in some cases within the supervisors and manager population, the skills that are important to their job they don't have as much of or not as highly rated in terms of their competency, and vice versa. The skills that they have the most of in terms of their self-ratings in these competencies are not important in their current role. So we'll quickly look at another position, and that's case manager. And so you can see the same pattern emerges. So respond to client needs with A. It's highly important in terms of the responses, and in terms of self-rating, there's a bit of a disconnect. B was establish and maintain a collaborative relationship with clients. Rated as highly important, doesn't come up as high in terms of a self-rating. C is use planning and time management skills. D is follow the code of ethics and apply the ethical decision-making model. And there's not as much of a disconnect there. E, use effective listening skills. Again, not as much of a disconnect. But then we see F, which is effectively operate computer applications. And as I said just a moment ago, this has come up as a definite gap. So it's rated as pretty important for case managers, but there's not as much confidence in terms of their skill set in effectively operating computers. G is describe the types of educational training opportunities and resources. So this is being able to refer clients to the resources in the community. There's a bit of a disconnect there. Demonstrate professional attributes is H, so no disconnect. That's good to see. I is foster client self-reliance and self-management. Again, another disconnect emerging. Keep current about the labor market is J, and that's the more significant disconnect within our case manager population. And K is establish and maintain collaborative work relationships. So again, you can see a bit of a disconnect, but it's fairly slight on that competency. With our job developers, we see an even bigger pattern of this skills disconnect. So A is support clients with work maintenance. B is liaise with clients, employers, and professionals. And both of those are relatively significant disconnects. Those are skills that are very important to the work job developers are doing, but the incumbents in those positions are not rating themselves as highly in terms of having those skills. C is guide clients in effective interview skills. That's another disconnect. D is facilitate work and work-related opportunities. Again, another key skill for job developers that the incumbents don't seem to have as much as they need it. Demonstrate respect for diversity with all clients. So again, this competency around diversity has come up again as important, but there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of the skill level. Use effective listening skills, no disconnect there, that one's F. G is initiate and maintain effective relationships with key community partners. Again, a really important competency or skill for job developers that doesn't come up as highly in the self-rating. H is follow the code of ethics. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And of course, with the CDPs, everybody's just gone through the 10-hour ethics course, so there's been some really recent exposure to ethics. And applying the ethical, so H is to follow the code of ethics and apply the ethical decision-making model. So that's the full competency as per the standards and guidelines. I, there's no disconnect, and that's establish and maintain collaborative work relationships. But there's another disconnect with develop relationships with other professionals. K is demonstrate professional attributes. That's relatively balanced, a bit of a disconnect there. And then L and M is demonstrate awareness and knowledge about diversity. There's that diversity one again. And demonstrate a commitment to lifelong learning with the final or the 10th. So you can see that at every point where we've sliced the data in terms of role, we've seen this same disconnect between the skills that are important in the current job and the self-rating of skills of the incumbents in those jobs. And as I mentioned a moment ago, when we look at the top 10 skills by the self-rating, so when we slice the data that way, we see another disconnect. The skills that come up as, hey, I've got this skill, I'm really good at preparing resumes, it doesn't come up as high in terms of importance. And Roberta's just going to frame that via our career engagement model.
Okay, so before I talk about the significance of the career engagement model, some of you know that Deirdre did her doctoral dissertation looking at this, and she'll be speaking about it in a minute. But just in the intimate group that we have here of 100 people in the province, Deirdre's dissertation is in Oregon right now, about to be delivered to California by tomorrow, at which point she'll be Dr. Pickerell. So I can hear the applause in the background. A very, very exciting time for us in the Life Strategies team, and it's been a long time coming, so we're so excited to have that. So from a career engagement perspective, you'll see that we've used traffic light colors to indicate where you'd want to be in that engaged zone. That's the green area. And then as you move out of it, we've moved to sort of the yellow warning kind of thing. And then you move out a little bit further, and you're getting into orange, you know, sort of a problem zone. And as you move further, you get to red, where people are really stopped and they're disengaged at that point. So you can see that along the bottom, we're looking at capacity. And there's a variety of components that would comprise capacity, both individual and organizational. And then along the side, you'll see challenge. And so to achieve career engagement, maintain career engagement, largely depends on having a good balance between individual and organizational capacity. Do you have what it takes to get the job done? And the level of challenge. Why this is important in light of what Deirdre just showed you with all the disconnects is that within our sector, we have managed to find people concurrently overwhelmed and underutilized. We didn't even know that was possible when we developed this model. And so what we've got are people who are identifying where their best skills are. They've got really, really high capacity in some areas, but their current role isn't asking them to use those skills. So they're feeling underutilized. They're not able to bring their best skills to work and have them appreciated. On the other hand, we've got people who are being tasked with competencies that they identify as important, but they're saying, hey, I just don't have high competency in that area. And so we've got a high challenge and a lower capacity, which is resulting in people feeling overwhelmed. And so our skills disconnect graph just pointed such a vivid picture of a sector of people that are slotted into roles and responsibilities that just aren't the best personal fit in case after case after case, in role after role after role. And what that's done is resulted in a group of people that are feeling stretched at work. They're feeling overwhelmed, but they're also feeling a little bit frustrated because of being underutilized. And aside from this skills research, we've got evidence of that to a lesser extent. There was less of a disconnect noticeable, but in Deirdre's dissertation research. So I'm just going to turn it over to her to speak a little bit about that.
So in my dissertation, I examined the career development or the career engagement of Canadian career development practitioners. And not surprising, considering I'm BC-based and have been for all of my career, about 50% of my respondents were from BC. And knowing what's been happening in the sector, I fully expected to get to have my BC colleagues being completely overwhelmed and perhaps even somewhat disengaged. That's not what my study has shown. My study has shown that the majority of practitioners are working within that zone of engagement, but there's a definite trend to being overwhelmed. So if we're going to go anywhere at this point, it's overwhelmed. There's certainly some people that rated more underutilized, but the trend is absolutely towards being overwhelmed. The challenge is that isn't corrected. So if we're not able to either decrease the challenge or increase the capacity, then we could find that those folks that are feeling overwhelmed or moving towards overwhelm could continue into that more orange zone and then become actively disengaged. And what we know from other research around engagement is that the actively disengaged are really unhappy, unproductive, toxic people to work around. And so we certainly, we don't want that happening in our field. And at this point, because there's been no studies, we have no idea what that might do to the services we provide clients. But if we look at other research, we know that actively disengaged people aren't particularly productive. They aren't doing their jobs to the best that they can. So this is, I think at this stage, a time to pause and reflect and just think about, are you experiencing this disconnect that our research, the skills research has identified, or how engaged are you feeling with your career, and what can you maybe do to right this balance to move back into the zone of engagement?
Before you move on, I also wanted to mention the dotted line that you see going up through that zone of engagement. That's to represent that none of us are going to be on this straight trajectory and get it right all day, every day. That in fact, we'll do sort of small corrections like you do if you're driving your car down the freeway. You're constantly moving that steering wheel. And so we'll find ourselves moving toward feeling underutilized, and we'll take on a new project or challenge. And then we'll move back into building capacity and then feel underutilized again and take on something else and maybe feel overwhelmed. This dotted line is so neatly within the green bar, but in our real lives, it zips up to the red and zips across to the other side. It's you know, a very dynamic model. The other thing I wanted to point out is that if it was a 3D model and we were able to glue disengaged onto disengaged, folding it over like a cylinder, disengaged looks like disengaged. Once you're there, it's going to look the same. But if you're working with a client trying to get them out of disengagement, or if you're working with a colleague or a direct report trying to move them out of disengagement, it's really important to understand what got them there. Because the fix for somebody who's underutilized is to give them more challenge. The fix for someone who's overwhelmed is for sure not to give them more challenge, but in fact to do some capacity building.
And the other thing is we know from various committees that we've been participating in that more change is going to happen. As a matter of fact, for the next couple of years, there's probably going to be a state of constant change for our sector. So as workers, we have to figure out how we're going to manage change, learn new systems, accept that the system you just learned on Friday is going to be new on Monday. And so how do you keep this skills connect, and how do you stay engaged in a time of really ongoing transformational change? So we also asked in our survey, what were the top job-related skills that you wanted to develop this year? And assessments came up as the top skill to develop, where it's not clear in terms of how the respondents noted assessment, whether this is assessment processes, so for example a needs assessment, or whether this is assessment tools. What we do know is that in other studies of our sector, assessment comes up all of the time. And there just seems to be this need or this sense that we need more assessment training, whether it's tools or in models and processes. In 2009, Roberta and I did a study on the use of assessment tools, models, and processes in Canada. And that showed that there was some, well, let's say interesting things going on with the use of assessment tools within the country. And it certainly raised some concerns for us. So maybe assessment, we do need more training. However, we also know that overall training in assessment, in terms of courses that are available, registrations have gone down because there certainly is training available in assessment tools, and we're not seeing a similar registration pattern in terms of a need for assessment as much as people seem to continue to want to develop their assessment-related skills. Computers, technology, and social media also came up, and as we noted in the skills disconnect, that's definitely an area where we're not feeling as confident. Marketing services came up, and not surprising, ICM came up quite a bit. Oh, ICM is the Integrated Case Management System for anybody that's on the call and not working at an EPBC center. So it's the new Integrated Case Management System for tracking clients. Usual methods for skill development that was reported were public workshops and seminars, conferences, and on the job, and that certainly is not a surprise for our sector. We hear quite often about the need and the desire and the preference for face-to-face training in a group where we can all get together and brainstorm and network and learn together. But we also know that that's a challenge for people that work in less urban areas where perhaps education is not immediately available. We know it's difficult to get groups together for release time. And we know that face-to-face training can often be more expensive. So although there's this preference for face-to-face training, it can actually be more difficult to access face-to-face training. And it's often difficult to get face-to-face training really, really quickly. If there's a new system that's announced or a new policy change that there needs to be some immediate training rollout, that will not happen very quickly or as quickly as it needs to if we're waiting for somebody to prepare to face-to-face training that's then delivered around the province. So there were some other methods in terms of the usual methods for skill development, and those were more self-paced, researching on the web, self-study, and accessing resources. What came up very little was anything around, say, taking webinars such as this one, or e-learning, any sort of independent but formal learning did not rate highly in terms of our population. So for barriers to training, the top two barriers that surfaced were employer training budget limitations and lack of personal funds, so money was the biggest issue. The other thing was staff backup issues. The commentary was people are running so lean that it's hard to release someone to go to training, but that of course assumes that you're releasing somebody to go to face-to-face training. Some other responses included limited time. All around it's not a top priority, availability of training, and organizational constraints.
I'm just going to quickly move through the next couple so that we're sure to leave time for questions for you. The transition challenges that we identified, as Deirdre said, we didn't set out looking for these. These popped up through feedback from multiple means of data collection. But they clustered into, following Bill Bridges' model, the ending zone, neutral zone, and new beginnings. And so we saw, both Deirdre and I were absolutely shocked to see anyone say that they would prefer Contact 4, but that's really what was coming up. And for those of you that might not know, Contact 4 was the previous data management system that was met with equal resistance when it was first introduced. And so now people are saying, yeah, but you know, it was more familiar to us. Certainly, challenges to do with time and new areas of specialization and funding, all of those indicated that people were not yet ready, and remember this was January, to move on completely, that they were to a certain extent still dealing with leaving the past. Then there were other challenges that clustered into that neutral zone, sort of that mid-place, a time of chaos but also creativity, and those were pieces of feedback that we got relating to fears and uncertainties and just not knowing where they were going to land. We also saw signs there of creativity and a hope, though, and indicating that I can't really see exactly what the future looks like, but it looks pretty good. I'm hopeful that this is all going to turn out. I think it'll be better in the year ahead. We also found changes and challenges related to the new data management system, as Deirdre mentioned, but also that people were forming new relationships and not really sure how partnerships work and not really sure who to refer to in the community, or the people they were referring to weren't yet comfortable dealing with new client groups. So we saw indications of that kind of uncertainty, but we also saw some positive signs of optimism and opportunities and creative solutions and partnerships that were working really effectively. So this model illustrated that we aren't moving through the transition lockstep, which you never do, but it means that as we're trying to find solutions, that you've got a large group of people that still haven't moved on much at all, another large group of people that are sort of mired in the quicksand in the middle, and then another group of people that are already in the new beginning and can't wait for everyone else to catch up. So there were several recommendations that came out of our research, and I'm going to let Deirdre just briefly speak to them. You can see the list on the screen, and then what we'll do is very quickly review our research goals and then hand it back to the center for wrapping this up.
There's lots of detail on these with the report, so I'll just give you a couple of highlights of a couple of them. because I'm conscious of time. So the first was share what's working, and that really relates to the those people that are in the new beginning, that are optimistic, that are doing some really creative stuff, that have developed workarounds, that have just been having a lot of success. That information needs to get out. There are centers that are doing some really interesting and innovative things, that are really excited about the possibilities, and that what they're doing needs to be shared in the hopes of replicating it and helping out the centers that are struggling. In terms of transition support, we noted in our report that in other sectors such as forestry or mining, this type of transformational change would have had labor force adjustment for, it's a fairly old term, and that there really needs to be some acknowledged transition support, both for those that are in the sector and planning to stay, that are currently in the sector but are looking to leave, and for those that have already left the sector. There is a wide range of professional development that's needed, whether it's ICM or computers or social media or assessment, whatever it might be. There's definitely some professional development that we need to look at as educators. And one of those was supervisor and manager training. We know that our sector doesn't have specific supervisor and manager training. And we know that a number of new supervisors or managers, or how long they've been in the position, I guess doesn't matter, but they've come up through the ranks. So they've brought with them their incredible skills in terms of working with clients, but they haven't had an opportunity to really develop their skills as supervisors or managers, and so they are feeling overwhelmed with how to manage their teams, manage their centers. We also know that some supervisors or managers have parachuted in, so they've come with management experience from another field. Perhaps they have MBAs, but they have very limited, if any, knowledge of the sector. And that's a problem, because they don't know the context in which they're now working, and how can they support their direct reports if they don't have that context around the career development piece. So I'm going to leave the other ones for you to give you another reason to review the report. In terms of reviewing the research goals, our goal was to identify the skills CDPs currently need, the perceived skill deficits or gaps, and the preferred approaches to skill development, and some existing relevant professional development and skill development resources, and we've certainly done that within the report. We hope that the research has increased your awareness of the skill deficits and opportunities for skill development, and to give you some language around this whole skills disconnect and why it might feel like I've got this new role and I'm not able to use the skills and talents that I've been known for, that I've developed over the years, and so why some of those problems are occurring. And also, we had a goal of helping to inform the development of a training strategy for BC Centre for Employment Excellence. And I don't know, Susanna might talk about that. I'm not to put you on the spot, Susanna. So we'll open it up to questions. Greg, hopefully they've been coming in.
We'd like to thank Roberta and Deirdre for giving us an informative session, and certainly information for the Centre to make informed decisions in developing its activities, especially for supporting knowledge enhancement. I want to mention two things, and one of them will be the training group. I want to mention that an ongoing activity that we're carrying out at the Centre to support capacity building. There are resources available on the Centre's website and the Knowledge Clearinghouse, with links to resources, articles, and tools to share the latest research on employment services. It also includes links to conferences, training, and other relevant events. We're adding new information on a weekly basis, so check back on the site often. The other thing I want to mention is that the Centre has initiated a small training advisory group that had its first meeting last week. The aim for the committee is to look at the training needs expressed by the sector in this study, and also from the Centre's consultations and other venues. The group will look at actions both needed in the short term and long term that can address some of these needs. We will let you know more about the work of this group as we make further progress. I will now turn it over to Greg Lockwood, the Centre Stakeholder Coordinator, and he will take us through the question and answer period.
Thanks, Susanna. We did have a few questions that came through during the presentation, and if you do have any kind of last burning questions that you'd like to ask before we wrap up, feel free to use the chat box to send those through. The first question is just a question about the presentation itself and if the PowerPoints will be available. So I'll let Sean take that one.
Yeah, our plan is to post the video of this presentation on our website, and we will be doing in a way that we can continue the conversation there. And we'll explore with Roberta and Deirdre about posting the actual presentation itself on the site. I know a lot of you were asking specifically about some of the details in the slides on the specific career, the professional profiles. I just want to remind you that the report, it was linked to in the invitation to the webinar, actually has a full set of tables and charts in the back in the appendix, and I encourage you to look at that. And we'll also talk with Roberta and Deirdre about how we can incorporate those into the presentation so that you have them handy.
And so that should also address a couple of the questions about those specific competencies, A, B, and C, which weren't listed on the slides, but again, you can find those in the reports. A question, and I wonder, Deirdre and Roberta, if you can scroll back to page 11 of the presentation. There's a question about the graph on page 11. And if the supervisors and managers were rating themselves on their own positions or if they were rating their staff.
On this particular chart, so one of the things I wanted to point out just to the previous question is that when you get the PowerPoint uploaded on the site, these A, B, C, D, E's are actually identified in the speaker's notes on those slides. It's just on our screen right now. We're showing you the full slide screen, but the definitions are in the speaker's notes, so you can see them right within the PowerPoint, not just in the report. But back to the question about supervisors, managers, what they were doing here was, first of all, noting in their own roles what, so as supervisors, managers, what skill sets they saw as most important, and then they were rating in their own roles where they saw their competencies. So that's where this particular graph would have come from.
Great.
So for an example where you see a big disconnect on L, it was clarifying and providing feedback. So they agreed that that was actually one of the 5th most important categories. That's why we have more than 10 here, because those were all tied. So it was one of the 5th most important things, but they actually don't see themselves as very good at doing that.
Okay, thank you. And another question coming in, career engagement chart on the challenge and capacity. Comment here, it's a good chart. I'm not sure if you're able to scroll to that particular chart.
Yeah, we'll get there.
And the comment is the reality in the job market may not work exactly as theory, especially for new immigrants.
Well, that's interesting. We just finished some research on foreign credential recognition challenges that we were doing around the same time as this report, and we used the career engagement model with that group. And so it actually, the model works really effectively because many foreign trained professionals are hugely underutilized. So they've come to us with all sorts of skills that they're ready to contribute to the workforce. They may have some barriers to employment in terms of comfort with the language or whatever, but very often they're completely unemployed. In our sector, we're not capitalizing on the skills they very well could be using even without language difficulties. And the roadblock is definitely for many professions in the credential recognition process. So people earn points to come to Canada based on their skills and education and work experience and professional credentials, but they're not permitted to work in Canada because of some of our regulatory bodies. And so you'll find a large group of those folks underutilized, but then also concurrently overwhelmed, much as we described in our sector, where they are not having capacity in certain specific areas in order to work effectively. So it's a model that really resonated with that group of people.
Thanks, Roberta. And we just have one more question that I'll send Susanna's way. And the question is, will focus groups or working groups be set up to brainstorm solutions to some of the areas of disconnects?
I think at this point we're starting with the training advisory group and looking at the results from the study, and also other things have come up in different venues. It is very possible that there will be a need to get these smaller focus groups and also working groups in order to target some of these issues and to get input from stakeholders as well. So I think that's definitely a possibility.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for your questions, and I'm just going to pass it back to Sean to provide a few closing remarks.
All right, thanks to everyone for attending our very first webinar today. Barring any technical difficulties, we will be posting the video on our website, and we really encourage you and your colleagues to post any other further questions you may have so we can continue the conversation there. As this is our first webinar, we welcome your input and feedback. We would especially appreciate any suggestions you may have for future topics, things that you and your colleagues would love to hear about. I'd like to remind you that our next webinar will take place on Tuesday, July 16 at 12 p.m. and we'll be featuring Chris Arnold, the Provincial Networking Group, and Chris is on the call right now. Chris will be speaking on a very popular topic, something that we hear a lot in our consultations, on networking and building relationships with employers. He's going to cover practical tips for engaging employers and give you specific networking strategies to consider that he and his colleagues have had success with in Terrace. The registration for this webinar is now live on our website, and you get the first jump at it. And I encourage you to go there and register as soon as possible, and pass the word along to your colleagues and others in the field. We look forward to seeing you all there, and hope you enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.